The dinner rush at Harlow's Grill hit its peak somewhere around 7:15, when the noise inside the restaurant climbed past comfortable and settled into something closer to pressure. Tables packed tight, glasses clinking. The low ceiling trapped the sound and pressed it back down on everyone's shoulders like a physical thing. Outside, rain was threatening, the kind of Friday evening weather that funneled people indoors earlier than usual and made them order another round to feel justified in staying. Ethan Cole sat in the corner booth near the emergency exit, which was where he always chose to sit. Old habit. The seat gave him a clear line of sight to the front door, the kitchen entrance, and every table in between. He could see who came in, who was agitated, which tables were trouble before they became trouble. He didn't think about why he did this anymore. He just did it. The way some people check their phone before they sleep, or test a door twice before leaving. The body remembers what the mind has moved on from. Lily sat across from him, her small legs swinging under the table because they didn't quite reach the floor yet. She was 6.5. She would have corrected anyone who left out the half, firmly, with the mild offense of someone who has earned the fractional distinction, and she was currently very serious about the paper placemat in front of her. She had 3 crayons from her jacket pocket, red, blue, and a brown one so worn down it was barely more than a stub. She was drawing something with total concentration, her tongue pressed against her upper lip, the way it always was when she was focused. The red crayon was working hardest. Something with wings, maybe. Ora cape. Ethan watched her for a moment before looking back at the room. The restaurant was upscale, casual, the kind of place that tried hard enough to justify the prices, but not so hard it made you feel underdressed. Dark wood paneling along the walls, the grain visible under a finish that was somewhere between warm and serious. Edison bulbs hung low over every table on thin black cords, each one throwing a small amber circle of light that turned everything within it slightly softer, slightly better looking. A chalkboard menu behind the bar with craft cocktails listed in careful handwriting. The clientele on a Friday night leaned toward business dinners and first dates in groups, celebrating birthdays that were close enough to a round number to justify the expense. Ethan didn't fit any of those categories. He was wearing a faded flannel shirt, clean but not pressed blue-gray plaid, the kind that had started as one thing and become another through use. His jacket hung on the hook beside the booth, heavy canvas, the kind that had been washed too many times to hold its original shape. He had the look of a man who'd once kept himself in exceptional physical condition, and who still, without thinking about it, maintained most of that, not conspicuously, just quietly. The kind of fitness that came from having needed it, rather than from wanting to look like it. His hands on the table were still. He wasn't checking his phone. He wasn't scanning the menu. He had read it when it arrived and remembered it, which was how he read most things. He'd chosen Harlow's because Lily had seen it from the car window 3 weeks ago and said it looked fancy. She had said this with the authority of someone whose previous frame of reference was the diner 3 blocks from their house, where the booths were vinyl and the coffee came in thick white mugs. He'd told her they'd come when it was a special occasion. She'd asked, with the relentless precision of a child who has learned to identify the gap between adults' words and adults' intentions, what the occasion was tonight. He'd said Friday. She'd considered this seriously, turning it over, and decided it was sufficient. He picked up his water glass, set it down. Across the room, a waitress named Callie navigated the crowded floor with the focus of someone who had been doing this long enough to do it on autopilot, but not long enough for it to stop being hard. She was in her late 20s, dark circles under her eyes that the low light softened but didn't erase. Her hair was pulled back tight in the way that started the shift neat and became something else by hour 7. She moved fast, too fast, slightly too fast the way people move when they've been on their feet for 8 hours and have at least 2 more to go and have stopped allowing themselves to think about that. She passed a 4-top near the bar, 4 men in loosened ties, the remains of several rounds of drinks on the table, the disorganized aftermath of a dinner that had gone on longer than planned. One of the men said something as she passed. Ethan couldn't hear what. He watched Callie's shoulders tighten and then release in the single practiced motion of someone choosing, again, the path of least resistance. She smiled the way people smile when they've learned that smiling is faster than the alternative, and turned the cost of it into something so routine they no longer noticed they were paying it. Lily held up her drawing. "Does this look like a horse?" Ethan looked at it. It looked more like a very confident oval with legs, 4 of them, arranged with enthusiasm, if not anatomical rigor. "It looks great," he said. "It's supposed to be a horse. It's a great horse." She squinted at it with the critical eye of a person whose standards exceed their current technical capacity, then turned it back toward her, and began adding details: a mane that was mostly enthusiasm, and ears that were triangles. Ethan returned his attention to the room. The manager, Gerald Howe, heavyset, somewhere in his 40s, with the manner of a man who had long ago conflated decisiveness with correctness, stood near the host stand and surveyed his floor, the way a foreman surveys a construction site. He watched for things that cost money, things that affected the experience of high-value clients, things that might generate complaints. He noticed everything that could be measured, and very little that couldn't. Callie came out of the kitchen with a full tray. 4 plates, 2 of them covered under metal domes that caught the light as she moved. She held it with the specific posture of someone who has carried this weight enough times that it has become structural: the slight tilt of the shoulder, the way the elbow locks. She wove through the crowd, and Ethan, without deciding to, tracked her path across the room. She was almost to the foretop, when one of the men leaned back in his chair expansively, without looking, the gesture of a person who believes space accommodates itself to them, and extended his leg. It caught the edge of her foot. Not much, just enough. The tray tilted. She caught it almost. She caught 3 plates out of 4. The 4th slid free, and caught the edge of the adjacent table before falling, and the sound it made when it hit the floor was loud in the way that specific sounds are loud. Not because of volume, but because of contrast. Ceramic and steak, and then silence. In that order. The room stuttered. Conversations broke off mid-sentence. Silverware went still. The man at the bar with his glass halfway to his mouth paused with it there, neither drinking nor setting it down. Even the music from the speakers, some soft, inoffensive jazz that had been playing beneath everything all evening, seemed to recede. Callie crouched immediately, beginning to gather the broken pieces, her face tight with the particular humiliation of being publicly wrong, in a room full of people who have made a tacit agreement to feel superior to whatever goes wrong around them. The man who'd extended his leg laughed a loose, liquid sound, unself-conscious, the laugh of a man who has never considered whether his laughing made things worse. "Careful," he said, without looking at her fully. "That's coming out of your paycheck." His friends laughed. The manager looked over from the host stand. He saw the mess on the floor. He saw Callie crouched among the fragments. He saw the 4 men at the table, saw which man was speaking and with what ease, and made in approximately 2 seconds the calculation that had been forming in him for 4 years, which problems he could afford to solve, and which ones were too expensive. He looked away. He turned back to the host stand. Lily had stopped drawing. She was watching Callie. Then she turned and looked at her father with the direct, serious gaze of a child who has noticed something that adults are pretending not to. "Dad," she said quietly. Ethan was already watching. His name was Douglas Merritt, though no one in the restaurant knew that yet. He was 43 years old and accustomed to rooms accommodating him, which was the most dangerous kind of person to give alcohol to. He worked in commercial real estate development, the kind that required constant access to city officials, and the kind of dinner meetings where the real decisions were made before dessert arrived. He was not a violent man by nature. He was something more insidious. A man who had spent decades learning that consequences applied to other people. By the time Callie was picking up the broken plate, he'd been at Harlow's for 3 hours. He'd consumed most of 2 bottles of wine and had switched to something brown. His 2 clients sat across from him, politely enduring. His colleague, a younger man named Brett, who understood which side his career was on, laughed when Douglas laughed. "Come on," Douglas said, leaning forward as Callie collected the pieces. "I'm just busting her." Hey, he raised his voice. "You missed a piece." Callie didn't look up. "I'm sorry for the disruption. I'll have this cleaned up in just a moment. You dropped the whole thing. I apologize. You should apologize." He reached out casually, the way men like him do everything, as though the world is an extension of their living room, and closed his hand around Callie's wrist. Not crushing, just enough to stop her from moving. "Look at me when I'm talking to you." The table next to them went quiet. Then the table next to that one. The reaction moved through the restaurant like a slow ripple. People noticing the way you notice something wrong at the edge of your vision, not fully, not immediately, but enough to make you pause what you were saying. Callie's face didn't change. She had learned to keep her face still. She said, "Sir, please, you need to learn to pay attention," Douglas said. Ethan watched Callie's fingers tighten around the piece of broken ceramic still in her hand. He watched the manager take a step toward the situation, and then, visibly, reconsider. He watched the nearest server turn away and find something urgent to do in the opposite direction. Lily's crayon had stopped moving. She looked across the table at her father. She didn't say anything. She was 6.5, and she understood. The way children sometimes understand things before they have words for them. That this was a moment where adults made choices. She was watching to see what kind of choice her father would make. Ethan looked at her, then he placed his napkin on the table. Folded it once, neatly. Set it beside his water glass. He stood up. He had 1 second of hesitation. He recognized it for what it was, the fact of Lily, 3 tables away, watching. The reality that if this went badly, she was there to see it go badly. He thought about this. He gave it the weight it deserved. He gave it approximately 1 second, which was honest rather than cowardly. And then he set it aside, because Lily was also the reason to move. He didn't cross the room quickly. He didn't stride. He moved the way water moves around an obstacle, without urgency, without hesitation, in a straight and quiet line. He stopped at the edge of the foretop. Close enough that Douglas could not ignore him. Far enough that he wasn't crowding. He had placed himself where he needed to be, with the calibration of someone who had spent a long time understanding how space functions in situations where it matters. "Let her go," he said. The words were not loud. They didn't need to be. The tables nearby had already gone quiet. And quiet has a way of spreading faster than sound. Douglas Merritt looked up. He took in Ethan, the flannel shirt, the worn jacket hanging on a hook across the room, the absence of any obvious authority. His face arranged itself into something like amusement. "Who are you?" "Let her go," Ethan said again. Same tone. Same volume. Same absolute stillness. Not the stillness of someone who hasn't decided, but of someone who decided a while ago and is waiting for the other person to catch up. Douglas released Callie's wrist. Not because he felt compelled to, because he wanted to make a point of it, the gesture of a man demonstrating he'd been finished anyway. "Mind your business," Douglas said. "This is my business." "You a cop?" One of the clients shifted slightly in his chair. Brett had stopped laughing. He was looking at Ethan with the focused attention of someone running calculations. "Apologize to her," Ethan said. The sentence was so simple, it almost seemed like a mistake. Douglas stared at him. Then he smiled, the slow, tolerant smile of a man who has decided that patience is a form of condescension. "You're serious?" "I am." She dropped a plate. She dropped it because your foot was in her path. Apologize to her. Something in the repetition bothered Douglas in a way the content didn't. There was no escalation in it, no matching of his energy, no invitation to perform. Just the same sentence, delivered with the same flat certainty, the way you might state that the floor is made of wood. And he kept saying it. And it kept being true. Douglas stood up. He was not a small man. He had 3 inches and probably 30 pounds on Ethan. And he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never lost a confrontation, simply because no one had ever fully committed to starting one. "I think," he said, "you should go back to your table. I think you should apologize to her. I think you should." He put his hand on Ethan's shoulder. He meant it as emphasis, as punctuation. It didn't land that way. What happened next lasted approximately 4 seconds. Ethan's left hand came up and turned Douglas's grip inward, at the wrist, not violently, but with a precision that transformed momentum into leverage in a way that had nothing improvised about it. Douglas's arm followed the path of least resistance, which was down and slightly behind him. His center of gravity shifted. He was suddenly, without entirely understanding how, not in the position he'd been in. He wasn't hurt. That was the most unsettling part. Nothing had been twisted to the point of pain. He was simply controlled, contained, redirected, the way you redirect traffic. His body had been informed of an alternative arrangement and had complied. Ethan didn't raise his voice. He released Douglas's wrist and took a half-step back. "Sit down," he said. Douglas sat down. He did it before he'd consciously decided to. And the recognition of this fact arrived about 2 seconds after the fact itself. The restaurant was very quiet. Not the quiet of people pretending not to watch, the real kind. The kind where silverware stops moving and conversations end mid-sentence, and the background music from the speakers suddenly seems far too cheerful for the room. Brett had pushed his chair back from the table slightly. The two clients were very still. Callie stood holding the ceramic fragment. She was looking at Ethan with an expression that hadn't finished deciding what it was yet. Douglas's face had gone through several colors. It settled on a dark, still red, not rage, exactly. Calculation. He was assessing whether what had just happened was something he could recover from in the next 30 seconds. And the answer was arriving as, probably not. A woman 2 tables away leaned toward the man across from her and said something quietly. He looked at Ethan. Looked again. At the bar, one of the servers had paused with a glass halfway to the shelf and was staring. The manager had crossed the room. He was at the edge of the foretop now, and his expression was that of a man who had arrived to manage a situation and discovered the situation had already been managed in a way he didn't entirely understand. "Is there a problem here?" he said, which is a question people ask when the answer is obviously yes. "There was," Ethan said. He looked at the manager steadily. "She's still waiting for an apology." Her name was Sandra Okafor, and she was sitting at table 11 with her husband and their guests from out of town. And she was the one who recognized him first. She had seen his face once, 2 years ago, on a security industry panel that had been covered briefly by a regional business publication. She had been in the industry then, corporate risk consulting, and the panel had been one of those events where 3 people say things everyone already knows, and one person says something that changes how you think about the whole problem. Ethan Cole had been the 4th person. She leaned across the table and said his name quietly to her husband. Her husband turned and looked. He didn't recognize the face, but he recognized his wife's expression. "Cole?" he said. Sandra nodded. At the bar, the server who'd paused with the glass, a young man named Marcus, who'd done 2 years in the army before going back to school, and who had heard certain names in certain contexts, turned the name over in his mind and found that it matched the face in a way that made his posture change. Involuntarily, he set the glass down. The ripple moved through the room differently than the first one had. The first ripple had been alarmed the animal attention to conflict. This one was something else, something slower and more particular. The way recognition spreads when the thing being recognized is larger than the room expected. At table 7, a man in a charcoal jacket touched his wife's arm. She looked up. He said something. She looked at Ethan, then looked again. The woman at the bar said, "Wait." Her companion said, "What?" She said it quietly, but in the sudden quiet of the room, it carried, "That's Ethan Cole." The name passed through Harlow's grill the way a tuning fork resonates not all at once, but in sequence. One recognition triggering the next, each one confirming and amplifying the one before it. Douglas Merritt, still seated, watched this happen without understanding it. He watched people look at the man in the flannel shirt and then look at each other with an expression that didn't belong in a casual restaurant on a Friday night, an expression more appropriate to the moment when you realize the person you've been casually rude to is someone you will be explaining yourself to for a very long time. "What's happening?" Brett said, very quietly, to no one in particular. Douglas was starting to understand what was happening. He looked at Ethan with new eyes, not entirely different eyes, but eyes that were now reading the same face and finding different information in it. The stillness that he'd read as passivity, the precision of what had happened with his wrist, the absolute absence of performance in anything Ethan had said or done. "Who are you?" he asked again. But the question meant something different now. Ethan didn't answer. He was looking at Callie. "Sir," he said, "I think you owe her an apology." Nobody announced it. Nobody made a speech. The information moved through the room, through the ordinary human mechanism of people telling each other things they had learned. And it arrived at different tables in fragments and in whole, and it assembled itself into a picture. Ethan Cole, 14 years in the special operations community, the kind of service that doesn't generate press releases. Afterward, a decade building one of the most respected protective intelligence firms in the country. The company's Sentinel Group had 17 employees when it started, and 240 when he sold his stake in it. The clients had been governments, corporations, individuals whose names carried enough weight to require professional management of the risks attached to them. He had walked away from it 3 years ago, following the death of his wife in a car accident on a Tuesday morning when she was driving back from a dentist appointment and a delivery truck ran a red light. He was living in a small house 40 minutes from the city. He was raising Lily. He coached her soccer team on Saturday mornings. He made her breakfast every morning without exception, eggs or oatmeal, or occasionally. When Friday's dinner out had gone long and they'd both slept past 7, cereal with the good blueberries, because some things are worth the extra $2. He had chosen the corner booth near the emergency exit because it gave him a clear line of sight to every exit in the room. He didn't think about why he did this anymore. He just did it. None of this was being announced. It was being passed in pieces between people who knew parts of it. The woman at table 11, who'd seen his face at an industry panel and retained it the way you retain certain things without quite knowing why. The server who'd served 2 years in uniform and encountered certain names in certain contexts and had a working sense of what those names meant assembled in real time across the restaurant. Each person who received a piece, adding it to what they already held and passing both pieces on. It assembled itself into a picture the way reputation always does. Imperfectly, impressionistically, with the gaps filled by inference. But the outline was clear, and the outline matched the man standing quietly at the foretop in the flannel shirt, who had done what he'd done without naming himself, without leveraging anything, without asking the room to understand why it should take him seriously. The room was taking him seriously anyway. Douglas Merritt, still seated, watched this happen without understanding it. He watched people look at the man and then look at each other with an expression that didn't belong in a casual restaurant on a Friday night. An expression more appropriate to a moment when you realize that the thing you've been dismissing is larger than you thought, and that the size of it was always there, and the only thing that changed was your awareness of it. Douglas looked at Ethan with new eyes. Not entirely different eyes, the same face, the same flannel shirt, the same absence of performance. But the face meant something different when read with context. The stillness that he'd read as passivity, the precision of what had happened with his wrist. The absolute absence of theatrics in anything Ethan had said or done. No raised voice, no threats. No attempt to be impressive. Just economy. Just the exact amount of force required, and nothing beyond it. That was, Douglas was beginning to understand, a very specific skill, the kind that comes from having spent a long time in situations where excess gets people killed. "Who are you?" he asked again. The question was the same as before. The meaning was different. Ethan didn't answer. He was looking at Callie. "Sir," he said, "I think you owe her an apology." Callie learned it differently than the room did. She learned it from Sandra, who crossed the restaurant after it was all over, and told her quietly who had stood up for her, and why that meant something beyond the obvious fact of it. Callie listened. She looked at Ethan, now back at his table, now seated across from his daughter, and tried to reconcile the information with the man she'd watched walk across the room. He hadn't said his name. He hadn't cited his credentials. He hadn't referenced anything from his past, or leveraged any of it. He had said, "Let her go. Apologize to her." That was all. Lily had drawn a picture. She was now drawing a second one, just as seriously. The manager's name was Gerald Howe, and he had been managing Harlow's Grill for 4 years, and in that time, He had made approximately 10,000 small calculations about which customers' comfort to prioritize and at whose expense. He was not a cruel man. He had simply stopped noticing when the math was wrong. He stood at the edge of the foretop and looked at Douglas Merritt, who was now seated and very still. And then he looked at Callie, who was still holding the ceramic fragment. And then he looked at Ethan, who had returned to his table, but who Gerald was now seeing with the particular clarity of a man who has just had a miscalculation made visible to him. He walked over to Callie first. "Take a break," he said. "I'll cover your tables." "I'm fine, Callie." He paused. He was not accustomed to what he was about to say. "I should have stepped in. I didn't. I'm sorry." She looked at him for a moment. She didn't say it was fine, because it wasn't. And they both knew it. She said, "Okay." She went toward the back. Gerald walked to the foretop. He looked at Douglas Merritt. Douglas was sitting the way a man sits when his ego is still present, but his confidence has left the building straight-backed, jaw set, performing composure he no longer felt. His clients were looking at the table. Brett was looking at his phone, the universal gesture of a man trying to find somewhere else to be. "Mr. Merritt," Gerald said, "I need to ask you to settle your check and leave." A beat. "Excuse me? Your check. I'll bring it to you now. I've been coming here for—" "I know. Your check." The room was listening. Everyone had stopped pretending not to. Douglas looked at the people around him. He looked at the man in the corner booth in the flannel shirt, who was showing Lily something on the paper placemat. He looked at his clients, who had the carefully neutral expressions of people who have decided to have no memory of this evening. He reached into his jacket for his wallet. In the corner of the restaurant, one of the men who'd been sitting quietly at a two-top began to applaud. Just him, at first. Slow and deliberate. Then someone at another table. Then 3 tables. It wasn't theatrical. It wasn't the kind of applause that belongs in a movie. It was the smaller thing, the sound of people who had been silent and had watched someone not be silent, and who needed to do something with what they felt about it. Ethan didn't look up from the placemat. Lily watched the people clapping with wide eyes. She turned back to her father. "Are they clapping for you?" she asked. He folded a corner of the paper. "They're clapping because they wanted to do something good and didn't. And now someone else did it for them." She considered this. "That's sad." "A little," he said, "but the clapping is real." Callie came back out from the break room 20 minutes later. Her eyes were slightly red, which she had mostly managed to address, and she had straightened her apron and pulled her hair back tighter. She looked like a woman who had cried alone and was now declining to have done so publicly. She walked to the corner booth. Ethan looked up. "I wanted to say thank you," she said. And then, because that felt insufficient, "I don't know how else to say it." "You don't need to say anything." "I know I don't need to. I want to." He nodded. He let her have that. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Sure." "Why did you—" She stopped. "You didn't know me. And you had your daughter here. You could have just—" "No," he said. "I couldn't." Lily looked up from her drawing. She had the direct gaze of a child who has not yet learned to make her attention subtle. "He doesn't let bad things happen if he can stop them," she said, with the authority of someone presenting an established fact. Callie looked at her. "That's a good way to be." "I know," Lily said. Ethan smiled, very slightly, at his daughter. She went back to her drawing with the same focused gravity she brought to all her work. "Are you going to be okay?" Ethan asked Callie. She thought about it honestly. Not the automatic "I'm fine" that comes from years of service work, but the real answer, which required a moment. "Tonight's been—" She exhaled. "Yeah, I think so." "Good." She stood there for another moment, not because she had more to say, but because leaving felt abrupt and staying felt awkward, and she was suspended between the two in the way you sometimes are when something important has just happened and you haven't yet found the words to put it in. "He's been doing that for a month," she finally said. "Merritt. Different nights. Different things. Little stuff. Mostly. Comments. The way he talks to me." Gerald always looked the other way because Merritt has a corporate account. A regular reservation on Thursdays. The kind of tab that clears quickly and without questions. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Has anyone filed anything? With management above Gerald? Or with corporate? She paused. The question hadn't arranged itself in her mind that way before. I didn't think. She stopped. No. I didn't think it would matter. It might. Now. What happened tonight is documented. I'm a witness. The room is full of witnesses. He said this without inflection. Not as a reassurance, but as a fact. There's a threshold between what's hard to prove and what becomes a pattern. Tonight crossed it. If you document what you remember, dates, what was said, who was present, it stops being your word against his account balance. She stared at him. You know about that kind of thing? He considered how to answer. A little. Sandra, from table 11, had drifted close enough to hear. She offered Callie her business card, Risk Consulting. Her firm's name embossed in simple type on cream stock. If you want someone to walk you through the process, she said, call me. I've seen how this goes when it's handled well and when it isn't. You deserve to have it handled well. Callie took the card. She looked at it. She looked at the room, the people who were back to their dinners, the steady low noise returning, the server Marcus refilling waters with the specific care of someone who is paying more attention to everything tonight than he was an hour ago. You know, she said to Ethan, I've been at this job 2 years. I always tell myself to just get through the shift. Come in, do the work, get home. Don't give it anything extra. That's not a bad way to survive, he said. No, she said, but it's not the only way. She looked at Lily, who was drawing with the final stub of the red crayon, pressing hard to get what she needed from it. Your daughter asked me if I was going to be okay. She does that. Yeah. Callie looked at the small, serious child with the crayon. I could tell. She went back to work, and the work felt, for the first time in 2 years, like something she was choosing. Gerald Howe came to the corner booth before they were finished eating. He had the manner of a man doing something formal for the first time, which made it slightly stiff, which made it more sincere. I'd like to take care of your check tonight, he said. On the house. That's not necessary. I know it's not necessary. I'd like to do it. Ethan looked at him steadily. Then, use what you would have charged me toward Callie's next paycheck. Gerald blinked. That's not complicated. No. Okay. He stood there a moment. I owe her more than that. You do? Gerald nodded. He seemed to be assembling something to say about what he'd seen tonight, about the man in the corner booth, about the decade of reputation that had filtered through his restaurant in whispers over the last 40 minutes, and he couldn't quite get there. I don't know why you did what you did, he finally said. Because she needed someone to, Ethan said. Gerald looked at Lily, who was holding up her drawing to examine it in the light. Is that a horse? Gerald asked. It's my dad, Lily said, without looking away from it. Gerald looked at the drawing. The figure in it had a large, somewhat rectangular body. 2 arms held out to the sides, and a cape that might have been an accident but might not have. It was rendered in the red crayon, which was now very short. It's a good likeness, Gerald said. Lily lowered it and looked at Gerald with the focused sincerity of a 6-year-old delivering a judgment. He doesn't have a cape, she said. But I put one in because it makes it more true. Gerald looked at Ethan. Ethan picked up his water glass. She's been saying things like that since she was 4. I don't know where she gets it. My mom, Lily said matter-of-factly, and turned back to her drawing. The table went quiet. Not an uncomfortable quiet. The kind that has weight and meaning. The kind you don't try to fill. Gerald left them to it. Ethan watched Lily add a final detail to the cape, a small star, pressed in red, at the corner of it, with great care. You know, he said, I don't actually have a cape. I know, she said. That's why I drew one. They left 40 minutes later. The restaurant had returned to itself by then. The conversations, the clinking glasses, the background hum of a Friday night, restored like a piece of music after a rest. But it wasn't entirely the same restaurant it had been at 7:15. Something had settled into it. A different kind of air. The way a room changes after someone opens a window. The room looks the same. The furniture is the same. But the thing you're breathing is different. Callie was at the host stand when they walked out. She handed Lily a piece of paper folded into a rough square. "I made this while I was on break," she said. "For you." Lily took it and unfolded it with the care she gave all paper things. A drawing, made on a white order ticket, of a small girl and a tall man standing next to each other. Both of them were smiling with simple, curved lines. The tall man had, lightly penciled, a small star on his jacket pressed softly, almost tentatively, as though Callie had added it last and hadn't been certain about it until she had. Callie had clearly not had much practice drawing. But she had done it with full sincerity, which is a thing that transcends technical ability in the way that very little else does. "It's us," Lily said. "Yeah. You drew him with a star too." That seemed right. Lily studied the drawing for a moment with the serious attention she brought to all art. Then she looked at Callie, with the direct sincerity she applied to all matters of consequence. "Are you going to be okay?" Callie looked at the 6-year-old, asking her this question with complete earnestness, and felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't known was held tight. "Yeah," she said. "I think I'm really going to be okay." "Good," Lily said, and took her father's hand. Ethan looked at Callie. "Call Sandra." "I will." He nodded. He held the door. They walked out into the night air, cool and slightly damp. The smell of rain that hadn't arrived yet but had been building in the atmosphere all evening the way certain things build. The parking lot was lit by the orange cast of sodium lights and the white of passing headlights. Lily walked beside him, one hand in his, the other holding both drawings. Hers of him, and Callie's of both of them. "Dad," she said, when they were halfway to the car. "Yeah. Did we do the right thing?" He thought about Douglas Merritt, and about the 14 tables that had watched and hadn't moved, and about Gerald Howe saying I should have stepped in a voice that understood what it was admitting. He thought about Callie putting the broken ceramic in the trash and then washing her hands and straightening her apron and going back out because the shift wasn't over. He thought about the moment he had folded his napkin and stood up, and the single second he had given himself to consider not doing it. And what would have remained in him if he'd chosen the easier thing? "We did what no one else would," he said. Lily thought about this with the full gravity of someone who takes ideas seriously. Is that the same thing? It has to be, sometimes. She absorbed this carefully. The way she absorbed most things he said, not taking it for granted, not dismissing it, but placing it somewhere she could return to. They reached the car. He opened the door for her, and she climbed in, still holding the drawings. He buckled her seatbelt, and she helped him, a ritual they'd developed in the months after her mother died, a small collaboration, her fingers folding around his when the clip clicked into place, as though they were both doing the same thing from different sides. He closed the door. He stood for a moment beside the car in the parking lot. The restaurant windows glowed orange and warm behind him. Through the glass, the shapes of people, the movement of them, the ordinary industry of a Friday night going on. Through the glass, he could see Callie at a table, setting down water. He could see her shoulders, which were straight. That was worth something. He wasn't sure exactly what. He stood there long enough to feel it. And then he got in the car. "You know what's funny?" Lily said, from the back seat. "What?" "The man was really loud. But you were really quiet. And everyone listened to you." He started the car. The engine turned over, with the patient sound of something that has been doing this long enough to do it, without effort. "Loud doesn't mean strong," he said. "Is that a rule?" "One of them." She considered this, turning it over. "What are the other ones?" He pulled out of the parking spot. The headlights swept across the wet pavement, reflecting it back briefly before the car moved past. He thought about how to answer, how to compress into something a 6-year-old could hold on to what it had taken him a long time, and a great deal of difficulty, and the particular kind of grief that teaches you things you'd rather not know. To understand. "Strong people protect the ones who can't protect themselves," he said. "And they do it without needing anyone to see them do it." She was quiet for a moment. Then, You let everyone see you tonight. Sometimes you have to. So other people remember they can too. The car moved through the dark street. Rain had started just barely. Just the first light mist of it. The kind that appears on the windshield as individual drops, before it becomes something more. He turned on the wipers, and they moved in their slow, rhythmic arc across the glass, back and forth, patient and regular, clearing what arrived, and then clearing it again. In the back seat, Lily unfolded both drawings again, and held them up side by side in the weak light from outside. Her version and Callie's version. The red crayon cape and the penciled star. Two different people's idea of the same man, made at the same table on the same night, with whatever was available. She studied them with the editorial eye of a 6-year-old who takes art seriously. Compared them. Tilted her head. "Mine's better," she said. He drove through the rain that was becoming rain, and Lily fell asleep holding two drawings, and the night continued in its ordinary way around them both. At Harlow's Grill, the corner booth sat empty. Someone had cleared it. The placemat with the worn impressions of crayons, the napkin folded once and left beside the water glass. The busboy wiped the table down with the practiced efficiency of someone who had cleared hundreds of tables and would clear hundreds more, each one an act of returning something to its neutral state, ready for whatever came next. He set new placemats, folded new napkins into careful triangles, centered the salt and pepper. The table was ready for whoever came next. Callie worked until close. She carried full trays and cleared menus, and wore the professional smile she'd worn so long it had started to feel like something else tonight, not entirely a performance anymore. Or not only a performance. There's a difference between smiling because you have to, and smiling because the pressure that had been pressing against the back of your sternum for a month has been relieved, even slightly, and the two feel different from the inside, even when they look the same from the outside. She refilled Gerald's coffee when he was still at his desk at 11:15, going through reservation records, and he said thank you in a way that had something extra in it, a weight he was trying to carry more deliberately than he had before, which is the first step toward carrying it well. She documented what she remembered, on a legal pad she bought from the all-night pharmacy 2 blocks down. Dates, times, what was said, who was present, who witnessed it and said nothing, and who witnessed it and looked away. She had 7 entries before she ran out of things she was fully certain of. It was enough. Enough to establish a pattern. Enough to give to someone who knew what to do with it. At home, a small apartment with a radiator that ticked in cold weather, and a window that looked out at another building's fire escape and, if you leaned slightly, a sliver of sky. She pinned Callie's order ticket drawing to the corkboard above her kitchen table, next to a photo of her sister and her sister's kids. Next to a calendar with the days crossed off towards something she was still working out what to call. She looked at the small penciled star on the tall figure's jacket. She'd added it last. She'd finished the drawing, the 2 figures, the curved smiles, and then sat with the pencil for a moment, not quite done. She'd thought about the way he'd walked across the room, the way he'd stood at the edge of the foretop without posturing, without announcing himself, without doing anything except being precisely what the situation required and nothing extra. The star had come from that, not because he was a hero in any theatrical sense, because certain things need marking even when the person who earned the marking wouldn't ask for it. She left it. Ethan Cole got Lily home and bathed and into bed by 9:30, which was a minor miracle, and he sat on the edge of her mattress while she fought sleep with the dedicated stubbornness of a child who suspects something interesting will happen the moment she closes her eyes. "Tell me something," she said. "About what?" "About Mom." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the rain had started properly, a steady sound against the window, not heavy, just consistent. The kind of rain that settles in and means it. She was brave, he said, in a quiet way. She did things that needed doing, without waiting for someone else to. "Like you, she taught me." Lily's eyes were closing despite themselves. She was still holding the drawing, her version, with one hand outside the blanket. The red crayon cape. The star pressed into the corner with what remained of the crayon, which was barely anything by then. "Dad," she said. "Yeah, you're the one who makes things more true." He sat there after her breathing deepened into the slow, total rhythm of genuine sleep. The rain against the glass, the hall light through the crack in the door, the strip of yellow that had been there every night since she was born, and that she had never once in her life gone to sleep without. He thought about a restaurant full of people watching a woman being held by her wrist and not moving. He thought about how much work it takes to not move when something is wrong, how it isn't passivity at all, but its own kind of effort. The effort of choosing not to, of making yourself small enough that you don't have to be involved, and maintaining that smallness against the instinct that says, someone should. He thought, I don't know if I made anything better. I know I made it different. Sometimes that's the work. He turned off her lamp. He stood in the doorway for a moment. In the dark, the drawing on her nightstand was barely visible. The white square of paper, the red lines. A figure with its arms extended. A cape. He pulled the door halfway shut. He went to make himself tea. He stood at the kitchen window while the kettle boiled and watched the rain move through the cone of the streetlight outside, each drop illuminated for a fraction of a second before it was gone. The house was quiet in the particular way a house is quiet when the person sleeping in it is someone you would do almost anything to protect. The kettle clicked off. He made the tea. He sat at the table. He didn't read. He didn't put anything on. He just sat with the tea in a room where someone he loved was sleeping safely. And the rain came down. And quiet was enough. Some men don't raise their voice, because they have learned that the people who need to hear them most are not the ones who are loudest in the room. They are the ones who have stopped expecting anyone to come, the ones who have learned to hold themselves very still and wait for the shift to end and go home and start again tomorrow. For those people, someone standing up matters more than they will ever say.